Now, this is hardly unique. It's something I've commented on many times in other vlogs. But if you stopped to wonder why every interaction with government or big business is now so fraught with difficulties, with complete misunderstanding, when you speak to their when you communicate with their customer service, they keep repeating the same thing, and you keep trying to say to them, no, you got it wrong, please listen to me, but they just keep repeating the same thing as though they're not actual humans that you're speaking to. Well, has the penny dropped yet? They're not humans. It's being done by AI. Now, when I used to teach at an international business school, I used to teach about the value chain, and that suggested that the closer one was to the customer, then the more value could be added by the business. Therefore, the very last place that you should automate should be customer service, customer-facing roles. But of course, those were the very roles that large companies and indeed government services were so quick to hive off to call centres, often on the other side of the world. And now that technology has been incorporated into their AI. So that explains a lot. Now, as I was leaving or emigrating from the UK some 12 years ago to move to Indonesia, I had to cancel my various utilities, services you might say. And of course you're meant to do it, if you look at what they want, you have to do it on your last day. So duly, early in the morning, I phoned BT to cancel my phone and explained I was emigrating to Indonesia, and then spent the entire morning being passed around call centre operatives in India who were trying to locate Indonesia on their database of UK names. Now, I wasted so much time with BT that I couldn't waste any more time on the other service providers and had to write to them, but some of them claimed to have lost my letter, causing great problems. But the biggest problem with this sort of call centre technology, or thinking if you like, being applied to business, is that every call is treated as a new encounter. So when you speak to people, they don't have records of the previous conversations. I don't know if they can't even draw them up, but they certainly don't have them, which would be very simple to do on a relational database. So that means that you have to explain even if you suss what's going on, you have to explain the problem every time. And they have a time limit on getting handling calls. So, if they can't find a solution within the prescribed time, they'll cut you off. Now, so pernicious is this way of thinking within big business and government that even if you manage to get through to somebody, you escalate it to a complaint, for example, and that's the only way that you can get through to somebody, to put in a formal complaint, when you're not really complaining, you're just wanting them to understand you, but when you do get through to people, it's evident that they don't have access to all of the records. You're the only person who knows all that has gone on. And, it's very difficult to try and succinctly explain what might have been 10 months, a year of communications to them and what the real problem is. Now, as I say, it's really been applied particularly to customer service, because Customer service costs a lot of money, you know. It's the obvious thing to do it to, except if you remember it's the customer facing part of the organisation. It's the last place it should be applied to. But yeah, as a result of this, nowadays there's a whole pile of companies and services that I'll never use again, because I know that I'll never get satisfaction if I have a complaint, if I have a problem. I'll never get satisfaction because I'll never get to speak to a real person. So I've just stopped consuming. But of course there are times, particularly say if dealing with government, when you simply can't do that. Now, I really don't want this to be about me and my tribulations, but it's the best way I have of explaining it. When my mother was dying, and that's another story, I was under severe pressure from the NHS and my relatives to get back to England because I had power of attorney. It's another story, yeah. But I needed to renew my UK passport, and it took them some 3 months, I think it was. 3 months to actually renew my passport. And again, I couldn't get through to anybody. Couldn't get through to anybody during that 3 months, while I've got people screaming at me, when are you coming to England? Well, I couldn't give an answer. So will I get to the point? Well, you may also be aware that for around a year I've been battling to get my pensions paid to me, despite having given them plenty of notice. I've also been battling to get hold of my inheritance, and that's gone on for over 2 years now. And, you know, one of the things is, few seemed willing to pay my money into my, well, I call it, it's a WISE account. It's a challenger bank, if you like, a fintech bank account, if you like. But they weren't willing to do that, and Aviva, who are the ones that I had the biggest problems with, nor would they pay it into a foreign bank account. So, you know, I've been hitting my head against a brick wall. But just today, Aviva have admitted to me that yes, they were using artificial intelligence. So all this time, while I was being told, no, it has to go into a British bank account, and I kept saying I don't have one, and they just kept saying it must go into a British bank account. So they kept repeating that for maybe it was 9 months, you know. And you think you're dealing with a human being, and you think, are they trying to tell me something subtle here? Is there something hidden here? No, it's a bloody computer that you're speaking to. You're not speaking to a human being. And so, yeah, that's what I've heard today. But the issue began when RBS debanked me without giving me a reason. But I now realise that it was a decision taken by AI. Why did they decide to debank me? Well, I live in Indonesia, which is considered a medium risk country, and we'll come to that in a minute. So that overrode the fact that I'd banked with them for 35 years. And indeed, I did have a business account with them, not my main business account, but because my business was so good and so profitable, one of the local bank managers tried to court me. And I said, well, look, I'll tell you what, I'll open up a bank account and see how you perform compared to the other one. When a new manager came, he closed it because he was doing so little business. You know, but they had all that information. Now, one of the reasons probably for all this, but we don't know because of purposely, the AI they use is a black box, so that management and senior management can claim they don't know why the decision was taken. it was taken by AI. But almost certainly one of the reasons is that Indonesia is ranked as a medium risk country. What that means is there's a medium risk of fraud from Indonesia. So therefore they're applying that to anybody who's in Indonesia. So yeah, Indonesia is a medium risk country, but what it fails to consider is that the vast majority of crime in Indonesia is committed through official, semi-official organisations, i.e. people with some connection to politics, government, the army, the police. Not the average citizen, and certainly not the average expat who moves to Indonesia. So because of the actions of this small group of villains, everybody who lives in Indonesia has to suffer. Now, I might illustrate that in as much as 20 to 30 years ago, adverts appeared in local press in the UK for salespeople. They were and they were small ads. They were recruiting salespeople, and they got shipped to Jakarta within 7 days of phoning up. Now, who would respond to ads like that? Well, they were fraudsters and criminals. Most of them also had an alcohol problem. So they were recruited into a boiler house operation because there's no legal problems on that sort of activity in Indonesia. Recruited into a boiler house to fraud expats around the world. Now, one used to bump into these British expats, many who had alcohol problems, in the bars of Jakarta. And not unnaturally in these sorts of places, sometimes they'd get into trouble, sometimes a fight would break out. But no sooner had it broken out and the police would arrive, arrest all the Indonesians who they'd been fighting with, and give these British expats a lift back to the flats that were being rented out for in North Jakarta. So you know that it was somewhat official, or at least the police were somewhat in on it. So the big problem with my inheritance, which is going through my solicitor, is that the Law Society says that money sent overseas should go into an overseas bank account, rather than, for example, my UK Wise account. But what that doesn't consider is there's no protection on Indonesian bank accounts. They're every bit as risky as my Wise account. I know the risk, but there's nothing I can do. I've been debanked by the Royal Bank of Scotland. But I also lose a lot of money on bank charges and exchange rate fluctuations by it going through that route. So, and anybody who knows the history of Indonesia will know that during the Asian financial crisis, many banks folded and many people lost all their money. And those who didn't, the rupiah crashed, meaning what money they had was worthless. So the point I'm making is that these decisions are being taken by black boxes that we can't interrogate and ask why did they make the decision. But based on, Indonesia does have a medium risk of fraud, but there's no understanding of why it has that risk of fraud and what the implications are for those people that you're discriminating against are using that information. So in other words, we take decisions without ever considering the implications of these decisions. Now, I'm not blaming anyone, I'm just blaming the thinking. I'm blaming that it's actually very bad management, or certainly the management I used to teach. So I've said it's bad management, but what do I mean? Well, if you remember, I talked to the value chain by which, the closer you are to the customer, the more value you can add. So therefore, customer-facing operations should be the last thing that you automate. The other thing that I've mentioned is that it's a way of hiding behind the decisions. Decisions are being taken, but management, and particularly senior management, can turn around and say, well, it wasn't me, it was this black box. And it doesn't have to be a black box. They've been sold it as though it's a black box, but it doesn't have to be. And in fact, the better way of using AI is to get the output from this black box and then turn that into an expert system. But of course, having a black box to turn around and say, well, we didn't make the decision, it was the computer, gives sort of a deniable, what would you call it? Denial of guilt. And it's particularly important for directors who have a legal obligation on the decisions they take and can be challenged for the decisions they take. So they're hoping that by saying, oh, it wasn't us, it was this black box, that they're not going to be prosecuted. But why are directors paid so much money? It's because they're meant to be taking the decisions, and those decisions can be challenged in a court of law. Now, as I say, for me, the upshot of this is there's a whole raft of companies I no longer deal with. There's a whole pile of goods and services that I no longer consume. If you remember, I said that the closer you are to the customer, the more you can add value. Well, I'm sure I'm not alone in having boycotted a whole pile of companies and services. So that's a whole pile of companies that think they've saved a lot of money by implementing, AI and call centre technologies, but are wondering why they're now losing business, probably spending more and more money on advertising to try and get it back. But ultimately, talking of business and government, it undermines the very economic system when we stop consuming, when we stop engaging with government, stop voting. Now, I can't be the only person to have spotted how angry and intolerant everyone's getting. Now, there are many reasons for that, but I'd certainly suggest that our inability to communicate with AI is contributing to it. And of course, when you can't get through to somebody, you begin to lose your temper. And my dad, who died 4 years ago, God bless him, he used to shout at these AI bots over the phone, Fortunately, he never swore at them, because of course most British males would start swearing, and the moment that you swear, then they shut down all communications, saying they have a zero tolerance policy towards abusive language. Well, I wonder why people become abusive. But I'd argue that the bigger effect it's having is on the way we think. So it's not so much the anger, but the way we think about things. So many of you might have been listening to me thinking, what the hell's he on about? They've got every right to close your bank. They've got every right to use AI. They've got every right to employ it in customer service. They've every right to tell you this. Indonesia is a medium risk country. What are you complaining about? You shouldn't have moved there. And, such thoughts weren't common in the general population 30, 40 years ago. I can absolutely assure you. And of course, you might then say, well, look, we're progressing. We didn't have the medicines, etc., that we did 30 to 40 years ago. We had better health, far better. So nobody's stopping to question, where are we heading and why? Because things are definitely not getting better. I mean, even in terms of wealth, people were far wealthier in the past. I mean, you can point to GDP, you know, and say, oh no, they weren't. But, you know, certainly 70 years ago, only the one person in a family needed to work to have a reasonably comfortable standard of living. Now, with even two working, it's getting increasingly difficult. I'm on my way back from the market now, but in the market I don't think accosted, I think that's too strong a word, but a lady who looked middle-aged but might have been much younger, just looked old, came up to me, and she was carrying a cup, clearly for donations, and a child's tambourine, you know, a very small tambourine, obviously for a child, and she was quite obviously not all there, or not 100% as they say around here. So why are there so many people round here that are not 100%? Well, of course it's interbreeding, and they always make a beeline for me. But you know, I always say hello to them, I'm always nice to them. And I am always nice and wave at young children and try and speak to them. So why is it that I make a point of speaking to those with learning difficulties and children? Well, it is because my skills in Javanese are virtually non-existent. And whilst I'm not so bad now at Indonesian, I'm not very good at conversation. It's spoken too fast and with too much Javanese interspersed in it that I find it difficult to comprehend. Whereas children, you know, I can normally speak to quite easily. But I was only thinking, you know, how things have changed, and this does illustrate a point I've already made. Because I'm sure if I was back in the UK, a man of my age, you know, past pension age, chatting to those people with learning difficulties and young children would soon come under the attention of the police. And, you know, there's a perfectly innocent reason. Now, of course, older people have always complained that things are getting worse, particularly in terms of attitudes, courtesy, etc. But I think this can actually be measured, and that is, there's been a massive increase in those people that could be classified as either narcissists or psychopaths. So it's now probably around 20% of the population. But the figures are much, much higher for those in power and authority. And I think there's plenty of evidence that they've had an influence on the organisations they lead, turning them into pathocracies. But what that means is that those people working in those organisations will have developed psychopathic and narcissistic thinking. However, you know, it gets worse, because the AI systems that have been sold into big business and government are what are known as large-scale language models. And they're not there to seek the truth. They're not there to give objective information. The whole reason for them is to pass the Turing test. That is to convince people that they're human. So they're learning human behaviour from us, because this is how they train, by interacting with humans. And if something like 20% of the population are psychopaths and narcissists, yes, you've got it. They've learned psychopathic and narcissistic behaviour. And I think that more than anything explains the increasing problems I'm finding in dealing with big business and with government.